Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
A few days ago, the Convocations Committee at North Idaho College put on their annual series. Each year they pick a topic and bring guests from throughout the country to address our student body. We're very thankful to that committee that they share those speakers with our TV program. The theme this year is Art in Life and Leisure. It is their hope and purpose to talk about both life and the arts as it relates to daily activities and how it affects all aspects of life. The first speaker to appear on campus and also to be with us today is Dr. Richard E. Farson. He has been with us before, about 3 years ago, and I must add that is always most challenging to our thinking processes. He is with us today to discuss the question of the political paradox of life and art. As to background, our distinguished guest is the president of Western Behavioral Sciences Institute at the present time. As to background, he has a PhD from the University of Chicago in the field of psychology. His vita is very long and includes many very worthwhile purposes. I will simply say that he is a former faculty member of the Humanistics Psychology Institute. He also served as dean and faculty member of the School of Design at the California Institute of the Arts from 1969 to 1973. And he has been a member of the faculty at the University of California's Extension Program. He certainly is an author of a number of books and articles. Included among his books are Birthrights, A Bill of Rights for Children. A second book is entitled The Future of the Family, and a third book is Science and Human Affairs. I really think I can say of our guest that he is a person who has endeavors in many, many fields. He is close to what one would describe in modern times as a representative of the Renaissance. Welcome to our program, Dr. Farson.
Well, thank you very much.
Joining with me in questioning our guest today are two members of the panel. First of all is Mr. Bob Brown, who's the Assistant Director of the Vocational Programs at North Idaho College, and Joe Webb, who's Assistant to the President of our institution. And welcome both of you, and would invite Bob Brown to start the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. In listening to your talk this morning, one of the quotes that I picked up was you were discussing the idea of parenting and how parenting classes sometimes produce the opposite result of what we would think, that in fact sometimes people, after having had a parenting class, turn out to be not as good a parent because they realize suddenly how much more is expected of them than they realized before. I was wondering if you, the very quote that I had was, parenting requires spontaneity. I think that's what you said. And I was wondering if you would also endorse the concept or comment on the concept that marriage requires spontaneity, or can one be trained to be a good spouse?
I don't think that that you can train anybody for the really important aspects of life. I think that's the key to it, that there are a lot of things that we can be trained to do. We can be trained to read dials. We can be trained to do the basic skills. But when it comes to human relationships, that's where training can't really help much. And the worst part of it is that it can sometimes backfire, that it makes it worse. You see, we can't quite, in America, we can't quite get it through our heads that you can't learn to do everything. We have the idea that all problems are solvable, that everything can be, in fact, considered a problem. We don't like to think that there are dilemmas, there are predicaments, there are continuing, unending, permanent troubles that we're in that we aren't going to get out of. We don't like to think that. We like to be an optimistic society, thinking, well, we'll take all these troubles, we'll divide them up into problems, and then we'll lop them off, and then we can train people how to handle them. Well, you can't train people how to handle the most important things like romance, for example. You can't teach a person how to have a romance because the very idea of romance is that you are out of control. That is, you're vulnerable to it. That's what makes it a romance. Otherwise, if you knew, quote, how to do it, unquote, it would be a seduction, not a romance. So it is with parenting. You can learn a lot about how children grow, but you can't grow one. Nobody knows how to do that. Nobody's ever known how to do it. The people whom I know, I've written about children, and I know the people now who write those books. I know that we are no better at doing the job of child rearing than the next guy. As a matter of fact, what you said earlier, that there's even some reason to believe that people who get training deal more harshly with their children than they would if they didn't have it. I mean, that's a crazy situation. But the fact of the matter is that when you feel responsible, and you couple that feeling with helplessness, you become abusive. It's a predictable event. And that's true in training people for marriage or for anything. When people are made to feel responsible, that there's somebody somewhere that knows how to do this, and if you'd only take the course or read the book or learn the lesson, then you could indeed have a good marriage or raise your children properly or have wonderful romance and so forth. The fact of the matter is it just isn't possible to do. It never will be, and we should be glad that we'll never know how to do those things.
Joe Webb.
I understand that you are president of the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, and while you are implying that we cannot be trained and that many of the things we think are solvable are perhaps lost causes, nevertheless your institute is in there trying. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Well, of course, I think I don't feel defeated by the idea that most of the important things are lost causes. I feel, as a matter of fact, somewhat energized by that. I believe that that is an energizing concept. It does not lead one to despair. So I think there's lots of things worth working on, even though I don't think that we're going to be able to perfect people or be able to somehow get some utopian condition out there. At the Institute, we're working on a lot of things, trying to figure out how it is that people can live successfully together. But one of the things we're trying to do, for example, is to find methods of social design that permit people to be more participative in the matters that affect them. We find, for example, that this increased reliance on professionalism, on centralized power, on the idea that we are dependent upon authorities or upon other people to do the things that we need to get done, has led us to a kind of sickness in our society. And what we need to do is to recognize that those things that were introduced as solutions to our problems, that's professionalism, technology, regulation, and all those things, have now become the problems themselves. And so what we're trying to do is to find ways of capitalizing on a very fundamental paradox, and that is that the greatest resource for the solution of any problem is the very population that has the problem. Now, we've known that for a long time, that the self-help groups, the mutual aid groups, and so forth, are much better at doing whatever they do than the profession that's set up to do the same thing, whether it's Alcoholics Anonymous or Parents Without Partners or Weight Watchers or whatever it is. There are thousands of such organizations now. They're all doing a better job of whatever it is they're doing than the profession is. And what we have to do is to come to believe more in ourselves and to set up the situations in which we can, where our own intelligence is elicited. That's one of the jobs we have.
Are you trying to set up the mechanism for more voluntary, that is, learn how to create situations which will elicit more voluntary participation?
Yes, as a matter of fact, one of our programs is that we're setting up a Center for Voluntary Initiative in which we're studying the whole volunteer sector of America. Most people don't even know that there is such a sector. I mean, they sort of know that people volunteer, but they think of America as divided into public and private, that is the government and corporate life, and they don't think of this 50 million member volunteer sector as being a major sector of American life. The people who are on the board of Harvard University don't know that they're in the same sector with the Boy Scouts or with the Sierra Club or with the Chicano Federation or thousands of other organizations and citizen participation groups and self-help groups and advocacy groups and all kinds of people. So what are the dimensions of that sector? We're trying to understand that, and we're also trying to understand what you have to do to manage volunteers, to elicit their powers, to place them in positions where volunteers ordinarily don't find themselves. We're trying very hard to understand how we can provide leadership training for people who need to think more broadly about issues. Leadership is a good example of that paradox again. You can't train people to be leaders, but you can broaden people's comprehension of the things that they might need to know in order to be leaders. I mean, that's important to do. That's worth doing.
Dr. Farson, I feel somewhat frustrated. There's so many things to ask, and time will not permit too much on this program, and I have to choose. But I was so impressed with your address to the students in which you indicated that life is a paradox. And I wish you'd, first of all, take a little time to be a little more explicit with our television viewers. Life doesn't seem, from your thesis, to be exactly what we think it is. I guess I'm saying in the technical age we think everything is laid out in a formula. You do this and this follows next and so forth. Or if we do certain things to improve a certain condition, then things will get better and people will be happier. With that very rambling question, could you explain to the viewers a little more about what you mean by how we should first perceive life before we even start dealing with possible movements towards solutions, whether possible or not?
Well, I think we could do. It's very difficult to convey this to American audiences because all of us who grew up in America have a very Western way of viewing things, a very Aristotelian way of viewing things. The thing is or it isn't. It is it's true or it's false. It's black or it's white. It's not both. We don't like to deal in complexity. We don't like to deal in the coexistence of opposites. There was a group of playwrights that came out of the post-war years in Paris, and they called themselves, they didn't call themselves, but they were called eventually, the theater of the absurd. Playwrights like Genet and Beckett and a number of those people. And the reason that they did what they did is that they said, look, we've treated theater as if there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Everybody is understandable. By the end of Act 3, we understand the dilemmas. We understand how everything happened. All the characters become explainable. It all kind of works out nicely at the end. They said, that is no service to people to pretend that life works that way, because life is absurd. It is overwhelming. It is unless you have the humility to see that life is only full of irony and paradox, that you are really missing the point. And so they wrote things like Waiting for Godot, which has no beginning, middle, or end. It is just these two fellas waiting for who? The Messiah? For who knows? Godot never shows up. That's the absurdity of it, and it is a powerful piece of drama because it is so jarring. It so violates the way we ordinarily think. Well, we're in the same boat. You try to understand anything, divorce. If you try to understand divorce by looking at bad marriage, you just will strike out. If you look at divorce and say, how could good marriage have caused it, then you begin to see, my God, we'll do a little counterintuitive thinking here. We'll do thinking that doesn't quite fit the ordinary way, and turns out you can get a lot of explanatory power out of an idea like good marriage creates divorce because of the high expectations that good marriages have about their marriages. And so then you can really begin to practice psychology. Otherwise, you're practicing some kind of linear common sense idea that is not, it just doesn't fit the facts.
That leads me to one other question before I go back to the panel. I'm really taking this opportunity and advantage since you deal with so many people in your studies, and you certainly would have data to look at. Dealing with marriage, relations in marriage, our parents and their children, our friendship, there are many relationships that are very precious and very close. From what you've said, both here and to the audience, it seems to me that you're saying that oftentimes, even whether we're talking about materialistic things or we're talking about humanistic kindness and attitudes, that when you are approaching other people and you give them things they did not have before and their expectations rise, that coming with that are disappointments, or sometimes they become more frustrated. Are you saying that the more kindness and understanding that you show in relationships, that you should be aware of the fact that it may not always be returned, or your expectations of what that will evolve over a 40-year period may not prevail?
I certainly do. Yes, I used to, when I ran the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute before, I used to continue to try to do things that I thought would improve the conditions for the people who worked there. And I realized that what I was met with when I did that was not gratitude, not satisfaction and appreciation and so forth, but kind of a new complaint level. People would come and say, well, essentially, why didn't you do it faster, more, sooner, you know, on and on. And now that we see that's done, here's what we really now think needs to be done. And I began to feel bad about that. But the fact of the matter is, I should have understood then that that's how you tell whether you did it right or not. Because all you can hope for, the most you can hope for, is that you have raised the quality, the level of the discontent. If you engender that, that's how we should mark the progress of any effort dealing with human affairs, is that what we will be met with is not satisfaction, but increased quality of the discontent. You have to listen to what people are discontented about. And if that works, then I think you got a leg up on the thing.
One final point. Even though I think that there's overwhelming evidence to back up your thesis, almost all patterns seem to have some exceptions. Aren't there individuals, though, that are so appreciative of anything that's done toward them that the more that is done, the more likely they are to at least show some kind of loyalty or support for those people around them that do that?
Sure. I think it's a momentary, fleeting kind of appreciation. If it persists, then you have to begin to wonder why. I think you really have to do, if you look, if what you're getting is satisfaction and appreciation, then you must be suspicious, because whatever you're doing did not take in such a way that it permits people then to see a new vision of what they might have that they don't have. And
I see.
so that's.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Dr. Richard Farson, who's president of the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, speaking on life and art and how that relates to other issues such as politics. We'll continue the question with Bob Brown.
Dr. Farson, on the political area, I was just wondering, given the recent election and the rather overwhelming results nationwide, taking what you've just been saying, do you see any application to people's complaints, let's say, reaching a higher level by what happened in the election, if we can give the political arena a little bit?
Well, I think we will see, if I'm guessing right, we will see great disappointment and disillusionment if things aren't going to happen as well and as fast as people now expect them to. I think that is one of the problems that President Reagan carries with him into office, is that he has essentially promised, implied, that it can really make a difference in what have been very stubborn problems indeed, in terms of international security, in terms of the economy and so forth. The chance of any party differences making major difference in those is quite unlikely. And so he is carrying with him into that a problem, no doubt about it. One of the paradoxes, however, is that he may be able to do things out of a conservative position that the liberals were unable to do out of a liberal position, but that will be what the liberals have wanted to do. Just in the same way that, say, President Nixon has been a lifelong, one of the strongest enemies of China, he was the one that was able to open the door to China. Only he could have done it, and it couldn't have not have been done by the previous democratic administrations that wanted to, but would have been seen as jeopardizing the security of the country had they done it. Right? Reagan is in a position to be able to do things of that sort. Out of his saber rattling, you see, he can do now peaceful things that the Jimmy Carters, who were presenting a peaceful image, couldn't have been doing because they would look weak.
Groups like the moral majority, do you feel that their expectations, for example, they, in listening to their comments now, they're already beginning, the spokespeople of their groups are beginning to show some a letdown feeling that the initial appointments were not of the caliber that they wanted. Do you think that the people who perhaps were not very politically active, say 4 years ago, who got active this time, if their hopes are not realized in terms of this golden day in American politics, do you think that they will tend to simply slip back into a lethargy again, or do you think they will continue to become more? Your speech this morning referred to groups that become dissatisfied, and then that they're the ones who become even more, increasingly more dissatisfied when things don't go the way that they wanted after they initially achieve a victory. It kind of frightened me. I was just wondering if...
Well, that's what's happened. I mean, the moral majority had extraordinary power and success. I mean, beyond belief, the power that they had and the influence for a fairly small group of organized people to have that kind of power in a national election is just extraordinary. And as a result of it, they are now somewhat angry at the things like appointments that don't quite fit their idea. It's very interesting. Their expectations have gone up now. Now they're really feeling their oats, and they're feeling, this is terrific. We're in the driver's seat, and the driver's seat is a seat of frustration and impotence, because you can never do as much as you see needs to be done, and that's why leaders always feel impotent.
Joel.
Well, in a way, I suppose democracy as a form of government is in this same category, that the minute you have some success, expectations rise, and that's perhaps why people are always saying it's a poor form of government, but it's better than anything else, right, because there is room for growth, and in spite of continued frustration, is there not? Well, I understand how your institute can get into policy areas, and particularly into ways to help the human endeavor in cooperation among nations. Is that not true? And what are you perhaps studying in that field?
Well, we're trying to find ways of taking tense situations, international situations. We have one actually on our border between San Diego and Tijuana, on the Mexican border there. There's a lot of border issues dealing with immigration and trade and health and environment and so forth. It's a real tinderbox in some ways. People don't think about it much in America now. They don't like to think that there's a time bomb about to go off in the next door neighbor in Mexico, but there is a good deal of reason to believe that the situation there politically is sufficiently unstable that we are in big trouble. We are experiencing it in San Diego very much, and of course California is about to become a third world state where the minorities will be in the majority in a very short period of time. We're facing a situation of bilingual education now, which may put us into such a separatist position that, as they did in Quebec, for example, that we may find ourselves in real angry warfare among the peoples of the state. So there's lots of things to worry about. We're trying to find ways of making bridges across that so that we can reduce some of the conflict, or at a minimum, so that we can expose the issues so that they seem more manageable, and that we can begin to show how at least individuals can come to consensus about some of the problems, even if the leaders have difficulty doing that. So we're using what we call interactive television, which is a way of showing a group on television made up of members of the conflicting parties, and then with call-in participation from the citizenry, we can begin to see how that feeds over a period of a week or so, feeds a process that enables the whole community to kind of get involved. And we're doing that sort of thing. We're trying to do it actually in Egypt and Israel and in Northern Ireland and some other places where there's lots of trouble, as well as our own domestic problems of integration.
Well, what other techniques are you using, for instance, in data processing and computer programming? Are there any ways of getting the kind of comprehensive feedback with a lot of variables that help in your studies?
Well, there are, to the extent that we used to do a lot of gaming and simulation and efforts to try and show people what the future could be like, that when you add a computer to that, you really do enable a lot more variation and a lot more speed with which you can do this sort of thing. It does empower you a lot, but the basic ideas don't change a lot. One of the things the computer has helped us do, of course, is when you're looking at systems, then you have to take into consideration so many facets that don't get considered otherwise, and the computer is good at doing that. See, we've always thought that life worked in a cause and effect way, that this was a cause and this was an effect of that cause, like a billiard ball, you know, just bumping one. Well, modern conceptions of physics and modern conceptions of human relations, for that matter, show that causes are effects and effects are causes, and there is an interaction between the two that cannot be understood in linear terms. And so so what we have is a much more complicated way we have to view human affairs, and the computer aids us a lot in that.
We're just about out of time, but in the 2 minutes we have left, I want to take advantage of your expertise as a futurist. In my little, very limited world, I have seen from readings and so forth, it appears that American people are going through a trend of thinking of life in more simplistic terms rather than more complexity, or some examples already been given here today, but that you do this and then this is going to happen. As you believe, I'm sure from what you said and many others, that we are even more complex all the time economically. We're tied to other parts of the world. Very quickly, could you give us what you believe in your expertise, insight in the next decade, what we may face in relation to this in this country and in the world?
You mean in terms of people's ability to grasp
the complexity? And could that make some political changes or changes in other institutions in our society if they get disappointed and it becomes more complex when they expect something different, a more simplistic solution?
Well, I think that the way to view it is that it won't be like this. It'll be like this. So what we're experiencing now, when we had Carter, we had a guy who was trying to convey to us that things are very complex, and that didn't sell very well. Now we have an administration that says, look, they aren't all that complex. They're fairly simple. They just go back to the basics. And now, when it does this, what's going to happen is that there's going to be an appreciation for the complexity, which Carter couldn't give it because he couldn't sell it. But trying to sell the simple will permit an appreciation for the complex. So it'll go like that.
I'm sorry we're out of time. I wish we could. That was very, very informative. Please be with us again next week. I am Tony Stewart.
I'm sorry.